In this next session, I want to move on and start to look at a few different aspects of how Premiere Pro works with effects. I'm going to first of all go back into the inspiration projects that we were working on yesterday. So I'll head in there. And here's the project. And the sequence was in pretty good shape. But there were a couple of things that I wanted to do to this to show you how Premiere Pro's effects system goes about its business. Now, first of all, I'm in, for some reason, still the audio workspace. I'm going to head back to the editing workspace. And as an example, fairly well down the sequence, I've got Lawrence at the end here. And let me just play you what Lawrence says. So I'm going to solo his track.
To get a career, actually, to be able to support myself and do what I want and be able to travel with children.
Yeah, and you can hear that he's a little bit nervous and he stumbles over his words there.
To get a career, actually, to be able to support myself.
Yeah, and I'd like him to say cleanly, to be able to support myself. I want to take out the little stumble that he makes there. Okay, so that shouldn't be too hard to do. I can, first of all, I can attack the clip and trim out the stumble. So I think I'm parked at the beginning of support myself the first time round there, and I'll just use the blade tool to cut the clip. And then I'll use the ripple edit tool to get myself into ripple trim and trim it up. Somewhere in here.
Be able to support myself.
Yeah, a bit tighter.
Be able to support myself and be able to support myself and do what I want. Be able to support myself. And
yeah, that's not bad. Maybe a frame off this side as well.
Be able to support myself.
No, that's too tight now. Let's go maybe a frame the other way then.
Be able to support myself and do what I want. Be able to support myself and do what I want. Be able to support myself.
That sounds pretty good. If you don't watch the picture and just listen to the sound, it actually you don't get disturbed by the jump cut in the vision, and you can tell that that actually works pretty well. Okay, now I've got that. What I'd like to do, obviously, is to fix the jump cut that we've got going on there, because that does kind of spoil the whole party. So let me come back out of trim then, and back out to the main part of the timeline. Now, what to do to disguise the cut? Well, a simple dissolve across the cut probably won't do the job. As you can see, there's a significant move on the background across the cut there, and just dissolving across there, you know, it will look a bit strange. So if I just option right click, apply default transition, and maybe shorten this down to some nice short duration, you know, we're going to get a very odd dissolve through, which isn't going to fool anybody. So instead of that, let me undo that and get rid of that. Instead of that, I'm going to use a different transition effect that Premiere Pro has available, and it's called Morph Cut. Now, over here where my project browser normally is, let me go back to the project browser actually. There we go. One of the tabs that's available in this panel is this guy, the Effects tab. And you can see that Premiere Pro's Effects tab organizes itself into audio and video effects, and then actually further down indeed into audio and video transitions and audio and video effects. So if I go and look in video transitions, lots of different categories of transitions available there. So all sorts of things. You've got different flavors of wipe transitions and page peels, some terrible, terrible things that you must promise me actually that you will never use. Slides, etc., etc. But the thing that I want to use lives up in the dissolves folder there. There's the one that we've been using so far, by the way. The cross dissolve, you can see, has a little blue box around it, and that indicates that that is the default transition that you apply to when you pick default transition. So there's a variety of other things in here, but this is the one I want, the Morph Cut. So I can carry that, drag and drop that from the effects palette onto the cut here and let it apply itself. And you can see it sets off and starts to analyze the incoming and outgoing shots. And the idea is to morph from one to the other. So on a frame by frame basis through there, it's matching the outgoing and incoming shots together frame by frame through the effect and trying to bend one to match the other. Now, if you allow it to do that over the default transition period, which of course is 1 second, it's very likely to give the game away. So this is much more likely to be successful if you do it over a relatively short period of time. Notice when I put this effect into the timeline as well, I get a red overscore over the top of it on the timecode track. And that means that this effect needs to be rendered. It might play, but in many cases, red overscored effects don't, and sections of timeline don't play perfectly. They drop frames and they misbehave in various ways. So as soon as you see a red section, it's really better to render it straight away. So let me try rendering it as it is now, and we'll see what we've got. So I can pick that item and head up to the sequence menu and say I'd like to render the selection. Now, as you can see, there's a variety of other renders possible. Render into out. Well, if you will render all the effects that are contained within an into out marked range in your timeline. Actually, if you don't have an in and out, then it'll render all the effects in the timeline from beginning to end. But this is what I want to do, render selection. So it'll set off and make a preview file for that section, and then it'll immediately play it back. You can see that the selection now has a green overscore over the top of it to indicate that a preview file exists for that section of the timeline. And if I go and play that bit to you.
To get a career, actually, to be able to support myself and do what I want.
And I'm sure you can see, yeah, you're never going to get away with that. He seems to stop talking. It's smooth enough.
To be able to support myself and do what I want.
But it's not fooling anybody. So to work successfully, this Morph Cut needs to be a short duration effect. Okay, well, we can change its duration just like we've been changing duration on any other effect up until now. Yeah, I can just click and drag on it, or I can double click on it and set a duration. I'd recommend about 5 or 6 frames, really keep it pretty brief. Let's try 6. And once again, it'll need to be rendered. So I've got the thing selected, sequence, render selection. Now let's have a look.
To get a career, actually, to be able to support myself and do what I want.
Yeah, okay, that's much more like it. There's a fairly abrupt change in the framing of the camera across there, but actually this whole piece is sort of handheld, so it is all moving around.
Career, actually, to be able to support myself and do what I want and be able to travel.
Yeah, and that's certainly not objectionable like that. Okay, so we've morphed across the join and we've blended the two bits together. Notice that as soon as you make any change to this effect, if I was to go and trim it by a frame or something, it's going to unrender itself and it's going to need to be re-rendered. Yeah, so the timeline is sensitive to every change that you make. Let me undo that. And in fact, having done that, I'll now have to re-render it. Sequence, render selection, one more time. Okay, there we are.
To be able to support myself and do what I want.
So Morph Cut, you can't always get away with it. Sometimes you get funny artifacts on the pictures. If you get a big movement of the head, you can get some very strange sort of extrusion sort of effects occurring. But it's worth a try. Okay, now another thing that I wanted to do in this little project was I've got some graphics that I'd like to bring into this project. I'd like to drop another graphic into the timeline. So I'll head back to the project window and I'm going to make myself a bin. I'm going to call that bin graphics. And into that bin, I'm going to go and import some stuff. So in the PP100 folder, in the stills folder, you can see we've got, we've got this guy. We've got the sohoeditors logo bug. Now I'm going to use this as literally as a little logo, a little bug in the corner of the screen. So I'll pick that and just import that into my graphics bin. Okay, here it is. Yeah, so this is, okay, as you can tell from its name, it's a TIFF file, and it carries with it an alpha channel. So although it appears as blue on a black background, when you place it in the timeline, it will actually layer itself on top of whatever's underneath it, like that. So all of that black is actually transparent. Okay, so what I want is for this thing not to be sort of plastered in the middle of the frame like that, of course. I want it to be, I don't know, maybe up in the top left corner, nice and small and semi-transparent so that it's not too intrusive on things. So, yeah, so first of all, let's do that. How do we do that? Well, we've got a workspace specifically for doing effects work in Premiere Pro. We've got this guy, the effects workspace. So I'm going to pick that and take myself into there. Now it's showing me currently the last selected item, the Morph Cut in here. But if I pick on the logo, selected in the timeline, it's going to show me the effects controls that are available for that logo. So every clip in a Premiere Pro timeline has some inbuilt effects capability. So you'll see that every clip has motion, which is the effect that gives you position, scaling, rotation, etc. And it's got opacity. So the opacity, of course, is the thing that allows you to adjust the mix level of the shot. And all clips have time remapping. We're able to change the speed of the clips, and we're also able to keyframe those speed changes. Now we'll look at time remapping later, but I wanted to do some very basic motion work on this logo. So if I want this logo smaller, well, of course I can come to the scaling number there, and well, I can adjust this in a whole variety of ways. First of all, I could just click on the number and drag. And as I do that, yeah, I'll be zooming the logo up and down in size. Let me reset that. Here's a reset for that parameter over here. Alternatively, you can see that scaling has a disclosure triangle next to it here. If I click that, there's a slider that I can use. Now the slider, interestingly, has a limited range. I mean, it's allowing me to range from 0 to 200%. So 100% is normal size, of course, and 200% is double size. But actually, you know, much larger numbers are certainly possible. So if I was to click on the number and keep going, you can see I can go way past 200 and keep going. So beware of these sliders. They don't necessarily, in fact, they don't generally offer you the full range of control that's possible. They just offer you a convenient, kind of normal range of control. I can, of course, simply click on the number and type a value into there. So if I want this logo 40% size, click and type 40 and enter it. Okay, now Similarly, I've got position numbers up here, and these are respectively X and Y position, and I can scroll on those to move this logo across the screen. But this is quite tedious, getting it sort of nibbled into place. So an altogether better way to maneuver a layer into position is to click on the word motion, the name of the effect. And the moment I do that, a wireframe appears around the image here on the program monitor. Now this wireframe has got control handles to allow me to adjust the scaling of the image, and if I click within, the position of the image. And if I click outside, well, the rotation of the image. Now, I didn't mean to rotate it, of course. I'm going to reset that back to default. Now, normally scaling is aspect ratio locked, and you can see over here in the effects controls we have uniform scale with a little checkbox in it. So that in turn means that it doesn't matter which of these control handles I click on, they're all doing the same thing. They're all holding the aspect ratio of the logo as I change scaling. But of course, if I undo that, well, now I'm free to do anything I like. So I better make sure I work in uniform scale mode to avoid my logo getting turned into a rugby ball as I go. So I'm going to reset scaling back to defaults, scale height, scale width, turn back on uniform scaling, and then scale the whole thing back down. Pop it up in the top corner of the screen, and of course, if necessary, as we did yesterday, we might do this with respect to some safe margins. Yeah, I'm going to push the logo right to the edge of action safe in this case, and maybe that'll do. Okay, down in the opacity department then, similarly I can set an opacity level for this, and once again there's a convenient slider there. Now this time this slider does represent all of the range of opacities that are possible, because 0 is completely gone and 100% is completely solid. So I'll set this again maybe to 50% opacity. Good, so there we are. Now let me turn off my safe margins, and there's my logo. Now if I just want that logo to sit there throughout, then of course I'm going to need to trim it out to the full length of the entire sequence. And although the logo is placed in the timeline with a default duration of 5 seconds, the same as graphics are created for 5 seconds. We saw the preference for this yesterday. I can, of course, trim this logo to be any duration I like. So I could come to the first frame, the last frame, and trim in this direction all the way to the end. And similarly, I could go to first frame and trim in this direction all the way to the front. Make sure that is actually front and end, because the start and end points of dissolves in your timeline represent snapping points that you may accidentally snap up against. So if I go down to the end of the sequence, that's exactly what's happened here. I've actually snapped to the beginning of that dissolve out, rather than to the end of it. In fact, I wonder whether this should go before that last graphic appears. I wonder if it should actually end here at the end of the last piece of video. That would probably be tidier. Now, looking at that as well, I'm thinking, that's not going to be very comfortable, is it? Maybe the bottom left corner of the screen will be better. And of course, I can just move that down there. So I'll use just the Y position numbers to push it down here instead. Back up here, again, similarly, I'll start this actually at the beginning of the first piece of video. And you can see my first piece of video actually fades in. So I guess the logo is going to need to fade in as well. Do this also for a similar duration.
something to aim towards.
My children inspire me to do better.
The children that I work with, they're a true inspiration.
To achieve more, get better.
And there we are. Okay, so we've put a graphic into the timeline. It's a TIFF file that carries an alpha, so it allows itself to be keyed over the background pictures. We place it on a video track above all the other images, and we've used its motion controls to scale and position it. And we've used its opacity control to set a transparency level on it. Okay, now let's go from there then. We'll leave this project behind for a little while and let's head off to Keyframe Trail and perhaps do something a little more complicated in Keyframe Trail. So I'm going to close this project. I'm going to save the changes when it asks me. Okay, yes please. I'm going to reopen my Keyframe Trail project. Okay, so here's Keyframe. Once again, we've got another element to bring into this project. We've got a nice graphic to go at the end of this sequence, in fact. So once again, I'm going to be a good boy and make myself a bin for my graphics. I'm going to bring the graphic file into it. So I'm going to import into there. And once again, in the stills folder in our PP101 folder, we've got a JPEG called Simon Berger. Now, let me pick that, import it, and we'll take a look at it. First of all, when I hover over it, you can see that it's quite a big JPEG in practice. It's got dimensions of 4608 by 2963 pixels. So it's much, much bigger than the TV frame size. It looks like this. So it's a very nice kind of Japanese-esque sort of rendition of the mountain scene there. Very romantic. And I want to put this down at the end of the sequence, perhaps with a little caption on it that just says, you know, visit the Keyframe Trail. So once again, I can drop this down onto the sequence. Down at the end there. Now don't forget that yesterday we set our preferences to default scale to frame size. So all 4600 pixels have been squished down to fit on the canvas of the sequence. As you can see, this thing isn't the right aspect ratio, and we've ended up with sort of pillar boxes at the sides as well. But just because this is squished in the timeline doesn't mean that we can't zoom in on it if we want to, because we've got plenty of resolution available to us. So I'm going to go to this image and I'm going to head off into the effects workspace. Okay, so now how far then can I zoom in on this image before it starts to degrade? Well, it rather depends, of course, on how many pixels the image has actually got. And one problem of working in the mode that we call scale to frame size is that we don't really know where the limit is. I mean, you can work it out if you want to. It's the ratio of 46 whatever it was divided by 1920. So it's 2.5-ish times size or something, isn't it? But there's a better way actually to do this if you want to zoom on graphics and you want to maintain picture quality. I'm going to right click on Simon Berger and turn off scale to frame size. Yeah, that takes it actually to its native size in the timeline. So my scale factor here still says 100%, but now I'm actually looking at this thing pixel for pixel. So any scale factor bigger than that will be actually zooming in on the pixels of this image. How far can you go? Well, it rather depends on how good the resolution of the image actually is. Let me see if I just pan across this to where there's some detail down here. I'd better go into full quality view and scale this thing up. Yeah, and you won't be able to go far, of course. You know, as soon as you cross that threshold and go beyond 100% scaling, you know, you will be gradually zooming in, and but you should be able to do maybe 125%, something of that sort, without noticeable degradation if it's a nice high-res JPEG. So I'm going to self-impose a limit of maybe 125%, and set that as the tightest I want to go. Now what I'm going to do is with this is this. I'm going to start at the top of the graphic on this kind of relatively tight framing about this little lone hiker. It's reminiscent of course, our man standing on his rocky outcrop. And I'm going to keyframe this so that we can move back and reveal the whole scene. So the framing I've got now is the framing I want to start from at the beginning of the graphic. So if I move the playhead back to the beginning of the image, and I can do that up here in the effects controls window, you can see that the effects controls have a little sort of a mini timeline that's the length of that clip. So move back to the beginning there, frame this up the way I want it. That's just about it actually. Maybe make some other little minor adjustment to the framing. I don't have very much room at the bottom of the frame, but that should do. And I'm going to tell Premiere that I want to start to keyframe this image at this point. So over in the effects controls window, each parameter has a stopwatch symbol next to it. And you can see that that stopwatch, the tooltip says toggle animation. It means literally, if I switch it on, it inserts a keyframe. Now, there's the keyframe. It's just visible at the beginning of the timeline there. And similarly, if I switch it off, well, it'll say, you're going to delete your keyframe. Yeah, so if animation is switched off, there are no keyframes. But with animation switched on, you start to create keyframes. So I'm going to toggle the animation on for position and for scaling. And that will insert my first keyframe here at the very beginning of the graphic. Now, I want this to be a nice slow animation, so I'm going to move down through this. Of course, the whole clip at the moment is 4 seconds long or something. Sorry, 5 seconds long. I'll move about 4 seconds down through it. It's about 3/4 of the way through it, a bit more. And that's where my second keyframe is going to be, and that's where I'm going to be zoomed out to the wide view of all of this. So once you've enabled keyframing, you'll find that any change you make to the numerical values will result in a new keyframe being inserted. So if I was to type 100 on there, for example, you can see that it immediately inserts a new keyframe. Similarly, if I was to hit reset, that's resetting the scale to 100%. It's inserting a keyframe as it does so. So keyframe creation is automatic once you've enabled the stopwatches. So I'm going to reset scaling and position at this point. Well, actually, not quite. Because I want to choose my framing. I still have all this excess resolution available to me. So I can go wider than 100%. I can come down in scaling until I get to what seems like a nice framing. Now, the wireframe controls, of course, are hard to use because they're all the way out on the edges of the image where you can't see them. But I can rescale my view in the program monitor. Instead of working in fit mode, which is simply making the preview image fit the screen, I'm going to come down to a smaller view, maybe 25% size or something. Maybe even less. That might be a bit ridiculous. But here's the edges of the actual frame. Here's its wireframe. I can choose myself just how wide I want to go. Well, I want a nice big vista like that. So I'm going to come quite small. I'll go back into fit mode, check that all's well, and make any minor adjustments that I might need. Okay, now if I play that, yeah, that's what I've got. So we're pulling out and out and out to a nice wide view. Okay, now at the moment the motion from one keyframe to the next is happening linearly at constant rate. So when we arrive at these end keyframes, the motion is kind of bumping to a stop. Not very subtle. I'd much rather that it decelerated smoothly to a stop when it got there. And Premiere Pro can do this. If I come to the this position keyframe, right-click it, you can see under the right-click, pardon me, I have two menus, temporal and spatial interpolation. Well, let's not get tangled up in this too much, but in temporal interpolation, I can choose from these two items, ease in or ease out. Now, ease in means decelerate as you approach a keyframe, as you come in from downstream. Ease out means accelerate as you leave a keyframe, as you move from it further downstream. So if I want to decelerate smoothly to a stop at that keyframe, I want to ease in to it. When I pick that, the keyframe itself changes shape. It becomes like a sort of a cotton reel shape like this. Now that will look a bit strange at the moment. I've said to ease the position move, but I haven't said to ease the scaling move. And that will result in some very strange, sort of loopy sort of look to the animation. This one also needs to be an ease in keyframe. That's much better. The first keyframe then is still a linear keyframe. We can only see the first half of it because it's literally placed on first frame, and so the diamond shape has been, we've lost half of it in the display. But you can see that the move kicks off linearly and only decelerates at the end. Now if I want it to accelerate at the beginning, well, as we say, that would be an ease out. So I can set this to be ease out from here, ease out, like so. So now I'll have a smooth kickoff and a smooth landing. Okay, that's looking quite nice. Now in practice, what I'd like to happen actually is, rather than cutting into that graphic at the end of this, I'd like to just crossfade through, cross dissolve between the two. So as usual, I'll right click and apply my default transition there. Now that cross dissolve then will be extending the front of the graphic. So the old cut point, which is now at the middle of the transition, is where the move will begin. And actually that doesn't look too bad, does it, with the easing in place as well. That works pretty good. I might like to actually dissolve this as it's moving. So if I reselect this item in the timeline, up here in the Effects Controls window, you can see, okay, here's the graphic, there's the dissolve, and that first keyframe is happening sort of in the middle of the dissolve. Well, first of all, I can move these keyframes. I could say, actually, no, I want that keyframe to happen there at the very beginning of the dissolve, like so. And secondly, I've often found that dissolving to something that's moving linearly seems to look nicer than dissolving to something that's sort of accelerating as the dissolve goes through. So actually I'm going to return these guys back to being linear. When you do easing, you change the nature of the keyframe from linear to Bezier control. I'm not going to get tangled up in Bezier handles at this point, but if I simply reselect linear, the keyframe becomes once again a simple diamond shape like that. And with the keyframe there at the very beginning of the dissolve, as I dissolve, the image is moving linearly down to its final resting place. Okay, that's coming along nicely. I'd also like to put some text on the end of this. So I'm going to head off into the graphics workspace and add my text. So my text is going to say, visit the Kumano Trail. Now I've already set up all of this so that I'm getting exactly the font and style that I wanted. But let me walk you through how that came about. First of all, let me just finish formatting this. So I'll take this text selection and I'll center it, and I'll put it in the center of frame. So of course in that text selection I've chosen a suitable font, and I've chosen this rather nice, well, it's a sort of Romanesque, ancient Roman thing called Herculaneum that I found on my system. So yeah, so all of that I've put into Herculaneum font. But also, now let me zoom in a bit on my program monitor so you can see in a bit more detail. So I'll go from fit mode into maybe 75% size. And you can see that my text actually has a couple of strokes around the outside of it. Now, normally stroke is disabled and you're just looking at the fill by itself. But Premiere Pro allows you to apply multiple strokes around the outside of the letters. So the first stroke is always available. And if you simply enable it, then there it will be. You can set a color on it. So I picked some sort of nice dark red sort of color like that. And you can set a size on it. So there's a size parameter over there. And I chose something around 12. Ooh, not 120, beg your pardon, 12. Yeah, that's better. But then next to, on that first stroke, there's a plus button, and I can click plus to add a second stroke. Set a size on that, and that will go outside the first stroke. So if I set that one to be similarly large, maybe something of that sort, there it is. And at the moment it's black, so I can click on here and set a color for this as well. I chose some sort of nice sort of dark teal sort of color like that. And you can keep going. As you can see, you can add more or you can remove the extras. So I thought that gave it a nicely stylized sort of look. The only problem with applying multiple strokes, I found, is that with the kerning, the letter spacing set at default, I'll go and reset that back to where I think it came from, which I think was 100. Yeah, the letters start to get a bit congested. There's just not enough room for them. So I actually space the letters further apart. And here in the controls, I've got the kerning control. So I can click on there and just open that kerning out like this. Actually, it was 10 to start with. I opened it out quite a bit to get the letters to spread apart. Okay, now let me go back to fit mode so I can see the whole thing. Incidentally, why 75% to zoom in? Well, because what the system's trying to do is it's trying to show you the image at 75% of its true native size. My program monitor, well, my program duration, dimensions are 1920 by 1080. Well, that's the dimensions of my whole screen at the moment. So if I was to go to 100% size, I'd just be looking at a small portion of it. So this is the magnification factor of the pixels of this image. And to get it to fit, well, it must be smaller than half size. I would think if I chose 50% size, it would still be a magnification. What about if you want to see your picture somewhere near full size? Well, we saw yesterday that you can expand a bin to fill the screen by double clicking on its header. You can do the same with the program monitor. And then when you're done, you can double click again and it'll pop it back into place. So in fact, any of the windows can be magnified up to full size if you want to. Okay, so I want this text to start to appear just as the background shot is settling into place. And then I want there to be a nice hold on the end. So I'm going to extend the background shot so that it sits under there. Now I could simply fade the text up or something, but I thought I'd do something a bit more interesting to it. And so I'm going to head off into the effects workspace now. And I'm going to, in the effects workspace, the effects palette appears over here on the right hand side of the program monitor. So opening up the video effects section, you can see that video effects are also organized into different categories. So we have all sorts of color correction methods, all sorts of video distortion effects, and so on and so forth. But in this section, in the blur section, I've got a variety of different ways of blurring. I thought it'd be nice to blur this text in. So there's an effect in there called Gaussian blur. Now, suppose I didn't know that that's where it was. Actually, you can search for effects by name. So if I come to into the effects palette, up at the top, there's a search field. And if I just start to type, Gauss or something, then you can see, yeah, it's filtered down and it said, okay, there's Gaussian blur in the blur and sharpen department. Great stuff. So I'm going to take that effect, I'm going to drag and drop it onto the text clip in the timeline. And it'll go and apply itself there. Its controls will appear over here in the effects controls. So there's the Gaussian blur effect up there. And I guess that as this text, so over maybe a second or something, I'll have the text blur itself into view. So at the beginning, I'm going to enable the stopwatch on blurriness, and I'm going to wind up the amount of blurriness to some fairly high value, sort of 40 or 50. And then if I come a second or so down, you can see the number here is 3016, so I guess if I come to 3116, I can set the blurriness back to 0 and the text will come into nice sharp focus. Like that. Okay, at the same time I want that text also to fade up, and I could use a default transition on it, but seeing as I'm here, I'm going to keyframe opacity to do the same job. So down here I've got the opacity parameters. Again, on first frame I can set opacity keyframing on and set the opacity to start at 0. I'd like to make sure that these two effects coordinate nicely with one another, so I'm going to step down to that second blur keyframe using this go to next keyframe button, and that's where I can set my opacity level back to 100. Incidentally, if you get that wrong, of course, if I ended up with this keyframe offset down here, if I drag it back there, then keyframes will naturally snap to one another as well. So here's Commando Trail sort of nicely blurring and fading in as the move on the background comes nicely and gently to a stop. Okay, I think I'll extend the music a little underneath as well. I think I'll just trim this down here someplace. Maybe even underlap it under there a little bit. That's all very nice. Good. So that's definitely coming along. Now, at the very end of the whole thing, I think I'd like all of this to fade out to black. First of all, let me show you how I think you probably shouldn't do this. I'm going to right-click and apply default transitions to both layers. Now that will certainly fade them out. But what's happening there is that each layer is fading independently, and you do get some slightly funny looking results from that. Let me play that. I'm sure you can see that the text looks like it sort of hangs. It's brighter and it punches through in a strange sort of way. Well, yeah, that's just just the way that it is, and there's a better way to achieve that that fade, which actually would be to, instead of fading these layers out, to put a black clip over the top and fade it in. So I'm going to get rid of these two fades here. I'll just Command Z a couple of times and remove them, and I'm going to head back to my project window and into my graphics folder there. I guess this would be the appropriate place to keep this. I'm going to create a new object. Now my bin is too squished up to actually be able to see the new item button. There it is. But you can also get to the new item menu actually just by right clicking and say new item. And the thing that I want is this, black video. When I pick it, it says, okay, I'll make you a clip of black. Just tell me how big, and that'll do nicely, sort of full frame, and there it is. So it's literally a black graphic that's been created. I can treat that just like any other. I can drag and drop it into the timeline, and I guess I'll apply a default transition to fade it in. So notwithstanding that it's a black clip, yeah, it can still be faded like any other. To see how much cleaner that is? Everything fades together because it's actually the black that's fading up on top. All very nice. Okay, so that's done all sorts of useful things to Kemano Trail, I guess. Let's play it through and take a look.